Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the last in this series of webinars on learning empathy and living empathy and learning from the COVID crisis. My name is Kitty Holland. I'm social affairs correspondent with the Irish Times, and I'm going to open up the floor now to a wonderful series of speakers or panel of speakers. We have 6 speakers tonight, and the first, I believe, who will be speaking will be Professor Kieran O'Hogarty, who is president of NUI Galway.
Thank you all very much, and thank you for the opportunity to join you this evening, and particularly to bring to fruition, if you like, the series that has been very well curated by both Pat and Mark. And thank you to them both as colleagues for this opportunity and for this work that they're doing in this challenging time. And particularly on behalf of NUI Galway, as the president of NUI Galway, pleased to support Pat's work in this context. Really important work as we see. And colleagues may know that I've been recently quoting Marilynne Robinson, and I thought this evening that I'd maybe pick up on that same quotation, or at least part of it, because I think in the context of empathy, it's quite powerful. So in her book, The Givenness of Things, which itself is a great title in the current context, she talks about, in the context of cultural pessimism, she talks about the potential for good that we have ever had, that we still have. So we still have every potential for good we have ever had, and the same presumptive claim to respect, our own respect and one another's. We are still creatures of singular interest and value, agile of soul as we've always been, as we will continue to be, even despite our errors and depredations, for as long as we abide on this earth. To value one another is our greatest safety, and to indulge in fear and contempt is our gravest error. And I think that last line in particular, that sense of valuing one another is our greatest safety, and to indulge in fear and contempt is our gravest error, is very powerful in the current context. I think, in a way, that phrase may be a phrase that will secure us all. That we know that in the context of COVID-19, one of the main controls of infection and the main prevention of infection is to value one another. We can talk about physical boundaries, we can talk about PPE, we can talk about other ways of doing it, but in fact, the most effective is behaviour. And the most effective of those behaviours is valuing one another. And I think that sense of empathy that comes out of the work that's done here, that sense of empathy for each other that we see in the context of COVID-19, I think is particularly important. For example, wearing a face mask is not to protect yourself necessarily, but to protect others. And keeping social distance is not necessarily only to protect yourself, but to protect others. And to work with the most vulnerable in society at this time is not just for yourself, but for others. And this is a very profound mission, I think, in the context of COVID-19. And the second part of that sentence, to indulge in fear and contempt is our gravest error. I think if you get the antonyms of those, fear of the other being really the absence of empathy, and seeing somebody as distant and apart and somebody to be afraid of, I think is, as Robinson says, our gravest error. And the opposite of contempt, the antonym of contempt, is respect. And again, that sense of respect that comes through in having empathy for somebody else, that sense of being with them and understanding their point of view, understanding their sorrows and their challenges, being with them in their joys, I think is a very important part of the COVID-19 experience, and something hopefully we will live with and we will learn. And then finally, in the context of Robinson, again, she finishes the book in a conversation with Barack Obama, and she talks about meeting people at book signings and in other places, and seeing these people that are deeply committed to sustaining people they feel close to or responsible for. And there they are, the people you think of as the sustainers of a good society. I think that sense of that we are together in this context, the sustainers of a good society, is very powerful, and a very powerful message, I think, for us all in the current context. But most of all, I think what we'd like to bring from today, and what I commend you all for in the work you're doing, is that sense of values that comes through, the values of our university as NUI Galway, but the sense of valuing one another. To value one another is our greatest safety, and to indulge in fear and contempt is our gravest error. And I know that this work today is contributing towards that sense of valuing one another as our greatest safety. Green Magav, and thank you all very much for the work you've done, continue to do, and I wish Green Gach Rahar and you, Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. And I think they're wonderful words to begin and to open up this conversation we're going to have this evening. Um, the next speaker is Dr. Charlotte Silk. She's an empathy postdoctoral researcher of the UNESCO Child and Family Research Centre in NUI Galway. She's been working with colleagues at the university and has completed a systemic literature review on empathy and pro-social behaviours in youth, which is a major study for the Irish Research Council. Could you tell us, Dr. Silk, what were the key elements that emerged from the review?
Thanks, Gilly. So thanks for letting me be here today. I'm delighted to be part of this panel and the discussion on empathy. So as you mentioned, I work at the Child and Family Research Centre, and I've been involved with Pat and other colleagues in carrying out a lot of research over the years on empathy. So what I want to do now is to just highlight some of those key messages that came out from the systematic review that you mentioned, but also some of the other research that we've carried out with young people here in Ireland. So the first point or message I'd like to discuss is just in relation to the importance of empathy. And Kieran mentioned this a bit, and it's something I've been really struck by over the past few weeks or even months, is that there seems to be a growing emphasis placed on the value or importance of empathy during the COVID-19 pandemic. And there's been lots of discussion about how one of the greatest tools we have in our arsenal to combat this virus is, in fact, our empathy, our ability to care for one another, and our willingness to make sacrifices to protect one another is, you know, one of our greatest safeties, but it's also one of our greatest strengths. And it's really moving to see how we've come together as a society in this regard. But I think it's also important to acknowledge that empathy is important and beneficial in ordinary circumstances as well as extraordinary circumstances just like this, and that it benefits us in our everyday lives. So from the research, we see that there are lots of benefits to empathy, both in terms of when we have empathy as an individual, but also when we experience empathy in societies and in communities. So for example, we know that having empathy or a stronger sense of empathy is associated with feeling happier in oneself, and that it's associated with greater life satisfaction, greater self-esteem, more confidence in oneself. We also know that empathy is really important for our social well-being, and that people with higher empathy tend to have better quality relationships and friendships. And for young people, we also know that empathy is really strongly associated with academic benefits. In addition to these individual benefits, research also shows us that there are benefits for us when we live in a society or community where empathy is valued and promoted. And some of the benefits we see in this regard relate to lower crime rates, lower prejudice. There's also economic benefits, and as we've seen during COVID-19, there are public health benefits as well. So I think these benefits that we see with empathy are one of the reasons why we feel so strongly at the Child and Family Research Centre about promoting empathy and cultivating a climate of empathy in our society. And to do this, we first had to understand where empathy comes from, or what influences how young people and children develop empathy. And what we've learned from this research is that empathy is very much a skill. So most people are born with a baseline aptitude for empathy, but whether our capacity for empathy is strengthened or weakened depends very much on the type of interactions and experiences we have with people in our social networks. So I suppose in some ways you can think about learning empathy as like learning a new language. Most people are capable of doing it, but we cannot do it alone. If we want to learn empathy, we have to be exposed to it and we have to practice it. And we know that the earlier you're exposed to it, the easier it is to learn, but also the wider the degree of exposure, the better. So from our research, we found that there are 4 main areas or domains that really strongly influence how we learn empathy and how strongly we develop empathy. So children learn empathy at home. We know that they learn empathy from their friends. They also learn empathy from the organizations and institutions they're involved with. So places like schools and colleges are really important, but also other places like sports clubs and youth clubs also play a role in shaping young people's empathy development. And finally, the community or society that they grow up in also plays a role. And what's interesting is that we learn empathy from a variety of different sources, but children also learn empathy in different ways. So typically we find that people develop stronger empathy skills when they're shown empathy from other people. So when they're shown empathy from their parents, from their friends, or from schools. But they also learn empathy through the types of messages and values that are communicated to them. So things like whether parents encourage them to treat others well, or the type of values that are endorsed by their friends or in the school environment. And finally, children also learn empathy from observing and watching others. And I think this is really interesting because we can tell children that empathy is important and tell them it's important to treat others fairly, but they're also watching what we're doing, and they're assessing us and seeing whether our actions line up with our words, and how do we treat other people that we know and other people in society. And they're learning from the example that we're setting. So this brings me to my final message, which was just some research we've kind of carried out about the barriers towards empathy. So what sometimes stops young people from showing empathy. And what we found in our research is that there's sometimes a disconnect between how we feel and how we act. And that sometimes we can have empathy or we can feel concern for people, but we don't always show it. So we consulted with young people in Ireland about what they thought the barriers to empathy were. And they identified 3 major barriers. And we see that this actually aligns with some of the research internationally as well. So first, the young people talked about how sometimes they don't show empathy because they lack the knowledge or the skills. So they said that sometimes it's hard to understand someone else's perspective if this isn't something you're used to doing. And other times that even when you do have concern or you have empathy, you may not show it because you lack the knowledge about what it is you can do to help. So they lack the skills to actively go around helping someone, or to know what it is that they can do to make a difference. And another barrier they identified was in relation to fear or consequence of helping. So something they talked a lot about was that sometimes there are consequences or costs involved in helping someone else. So these might be something small like being embarrassed, or that they're afraid that their kindness or their empathy can be taken advantage of. But they also related this to wider concerns about the value that's placed on empathy in society. And for them, from their perspective, they felt that empathy was not always something that was valued in society, that the messages, the dominant messages that are communicated are in terms of individual success, that it's important to achieve well as an individual, to do well at school or to get a good job or to earn lots of money, that these are the values that we promote the most. And so they were afraid that if you're taking time out to help someone else, that you may miss out on certain opportunities that would help you achieve your optimal success. So there was sometimes a conflict between wanting to help someone else, but also wanting what was best for themselves. And the third barrier they identified is something which is often referred to in the literature as an empathy bias. And what we mean by this is that we see that empathy is not something that's always shown equally. That young people talked about how sometimes it's easier to show empathy in certain situations, like emergency situations, and that it's easier to have empathy or to help people, help certain people than other people, like to help your friends or your family, or you care more about your friends and your family than you may do someone you don't know, or someone that you don't like as much. So these were just some of the barriers or the findings that came out from our research. And I think these messages are interesting, and it's interesting to consider them in the context of COVID-19 about especially about how some of the messages from society in terms of the value and importance of empathy is changing. And I think maybe one of the things we need to think about now as a society is how we can maintain this culture of empathy that we've created in order to continue to thrive as a society, both during this pandemic, but also after and beyond as well.
Thank you, Dr. Silk. That was in some ways a bit depressing, but also I suppose very hopeful, and nice to hit a hopeful note at the end. I'm going to come now to Jack Gaffey, who is also in the who's also in the department in Galway in the Child and Family Research. He's a researcher, and he is going to tell us about a video. He's been involved in the empathy research program and has been involved in the production of a youth-led messages video, which he's going to tell us a bit more about now.
Hello, thank you for having me on the webinar again. I'm glad to be here. My name is Jack Gaffey, and I'm a youth researcher at the UNESCO Child and Family Research Centre in NUI Galway. For the past 2 years, I've been volunteering in the centre to promote empathy and pro-social behaviour and try to ensure that youth voices are heard, and not just heard, but also listened to in the academic sphere. So I'm very thankful for that as well, because for the work that I've done, I've gotten to meet a number of young people who aren't just actively interested in taking part, but who are want to feel and promote empathy, but also practice it in their home lives or in their school lives or in the wider community. So in late 2018, Professor Pat Dolan, came to myself and my fellow youth researcher, Ella Anderson, and asked us to take part in a event that he would be hosting later in the new year, which was to celebrate the 10-year anniversary of the UNESCO chair. The center had just undergone a study which assessed 712 to 16-year-olds in Ireland on their social behaviors and their civic civic values and empathy. And Pat asked us to make a video for the night that would be related to this research study. The study itself was really interesting, actually, because it reaffirmed that young people are empathetic and they do feel empathy, which in truth is obvious. And what was interesting about it was, as Charlotte was saying, is that young people, they come to a stop when it comes to acting as a result of those feelings. And I suppose it's the difference between feeling bad and for someone and actually doing good to help someone. So we got a lot of help from our directors, Roisin Dolan and Kate Murray, who, in all honesty, we probably couldn't have done it without. And Ella and I had friends who were drama students and members of the NUIG Drama Society. And we came up with a little script that highlighted the key features of the study and took out quotes from the study to act out and give a voice to these young people's beliefs about empathy. So I'm sad to say that you can really tell the difference between myself and the professional actors, but that's neither here nor there. We named the video Youth Voices, Messages from the Research, and we tried to take into account that idea of taking action, that action speaks louder than words. So the big day was in February, and the theme of the night was in Dublin in the Royal College of Surgeons. The theme of the night was Artists for Empathy, which you can kind of tell from the cast of guests, who included the writer Sally Rooney and the poet Roisin Higgins, and of course Cillian Murphy, who is the patron of the Child and Family Research Centre, who was kind enough to co-host the night. But despite all these names, I think that really it was the youth who kind of stole the show on that night, which I hope was the point, to give them a platform. Apart from myself and my own group, there was also Roisin Hanley, who did a video called In My Shoes, which I believe has actually been showed on the webinar already. And also there was a very funny interview done by Ciara Beth and Aisling Dunphy, where they interviewed Pat and Cillian on their experiences being young people growing up in Ireland, and with their experiences with the Leaving Cert, which I think got compared to a glorified pub quiz. So it was a fantastic night, and it was a really great experience, and I think we should probably be ready to show the video, so I hope you enjoy it as much as we did making it.
Action.
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 Action speaks louder than words. A lot of people don't want to hear from us.
We're considered too young, just kids.
They don't want to hear from us because they're like,
What do you guys know?
Young people in Ireland feel empathy and social responsibility.
But we may not always show it.
Sometimes it's hard to know where to start. We're like, okay, I want to help, but how?
Sometimes what stops people our age showing empathy is being judged.
Being judged for being different.
For caring.
For being weak.
Research suggests that boys show lower empathy than girls.
If you're a boy, there's some people who act like they're hard, but they're not.
If you're a boy, you're supposed to be hard and tough, you know? That's the act you have to put on.
It depends who you hang out with.
Did you know that young people whose families and friends show pro-social behaviour have a greater sense of empathy?
If you're surrounded by people who judge others as they pass by, you're going to learn to be like that.
Whereas if you're surrounded by people who take into consideration what you're going through,
You're more likely to be like that.
One thing's for sure.
We spend so much time in school and then we leave and we're literally thrown out into the real world.
Maybe if they focused more on teaching us about life, feelings, empathy.
It can be a positive tool that connects young people.
there are a lot of YouTubers and stuff that do videos on homelessness and stuff like that, and that can have a positive influence.
But on the other hand,
It also encourages narcissism and individualism.
I feel like social media now, it's so focused on becoming famous at the expense of someone else.
Like everything we see, memes, vines, stuff like that, a big percentage of it is hurting someone.
Someone is getting hurt.
Someone is getting embarrassed.
and that's what we think is funny.
But it's not.
Feeling connected helps.
Connected to something.
Connected to our local communities.
Drama, music, involvement in youth clubs.
All these things promote higher levels of empathy.
Specific challenges to promoting empathy in the school system require targeted solutions.
Here's what we know.
Action.
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 Action speaks louder than words.
That was great. Really, really lovely. I'm going to come now to Professor Mark Brennan. He's the UNESCO Chair in Community Leadership and Youth Development at the Pennsylvania State University, obviously in the United States. Mark, what have been the key messages and take-home learnings you've had from the previous webinars?
Thanks, Katie, and thanks to everyone who's been part of this over the last 3 months, which is amazing. And thanks, Jack. That's really powerful work, and it's really big shoes to follow in here. Really, these global conversations have just been amazing. And like I said, it's been 3 months now, 12 of these, and we've revealed countless ways that empathy is needed, that it's shared, that it's received, and how it grows within our actions. So I kind of took note of a few, but this is by no means complete. But I think the one thing that, some of the things that stood out, first of all, is that I think we need empathy now more than ever. Empathy wasn't just for when the pandemic was at its worst. Now, as we see life starting to return to normal, or at least we get used to COVID-19 as being part of life, it's a different world. And I think we need it as much as we did during the peak of it. It's also the case that in places like America right now, and South America and other places, the virus is exploding. And It's tearing apart communities and countries at the seams. And I think this goes back to what Kieran said as we started, that this is there's a need for citizenship here. There's a need to look out for each other. There's a need for all of these sort of things. And there's countless ways that we need empathy in our own lives. And I think now as we kind of enter this new stage of the pandemic, whether it's continuing to grow as it is in America, or if there's a second wave coming in other parts of the world, there remains an awful lot of anger and frustration and fear and uncertainty among people. And all of us as individuals, we have a role to play to help people deal with these. Because if we don't, it's just going to get worse. And we have a duty and really a calling to practice empathy from now on. Another big thing that came out of all the webinars and the research that Charlotte mentioned, that they have done, and that Kate will talk about, is that this need for empathy, it cuts across all groups. It cuts across every age, gender, religion, income, special needs, everyone, everywhere. There's no group that doesn't need it, or there's no group that can't provide it. Within the context, I think it's important to notice too that we need to talk about this in ourselves. This includes ourselves. We need to have some self-empathy. We need to give ourselves a break as we're trying to deal with all these issues and look after others. It's an important piece of it there. Another big thing that I thought was really important that shown through all of the different webinars, that there's countless ways for us to exhibit empathy. And there are no small actions. I think that's something we really need to stress. And that came out through one of our early webinars with folks from the Fred Rogers Foundation. And it's actually these small actions that sometimes make the biggest differences. It's the kind words, the thoughtful actions, the email or the text you send just checking in on someone. They tend to snowball. And I think a lot of us tend to be humble to think that, the small efforts that we take part in don't make that much of a difference. Fact of the matter is they do. And they all come together to make a difference. It's much, much stronger than just the sum of its parts. Two other things I thought I would mention, and then we can get on to things. First of all, and I think Charlotte made just a fantastic point in her talk, that empathy matters. It's real and it's tangible, and there's all different ways that it makes a difference. We have lots of research on that. We have lots of evidence from practice in all different settings, that it's not just a simple feel-good activity. It's incredibly measurable and has high impacts on your health, on your learning, your well-being, your productivity, your relationships, and countless other ways. And if we're not practicing empathy for the right reason, we should at least practice it because it's in our own self-interests and the interests of the people we care about and others. The more we practice these things, the better off we're going to be. It's as simple as that, and we've got mountains of evidence for that. One last thing I would just mention is the need for us to act, not for us just to be sympathetic, not just to show sympathy. We need empathy and we need action. And I think the youth video there summed that up perfectly and ended perfectly with that. We've got to do something, and that's anything. But as one of our earlier webinars talked about, I think we need to look for those moments where we can give and receive empathy. And I would ask everyone and encourage everyone, pay close attention to those opportunities and look for when you might act. They might be helping someone in a local shop. They might be calling out intolerance that you hear. They might just be listening to people. But the opportunities are endless, and we tend to often not keep our eyes open for those. So look out for them. And when you see them, when you have those chances to act, do it. Show empathy, receive empathy, and we're all going to get through these things better, and the world's going to be much better in general, beyond this pandemic and everything else.
Thank you very much. Next, we're going to come to Professor Pat Dolan from he's the chair of the UNESCO Centre for Child Research at NUI Galway, and an old friend. Pat, tell us, what have been the common issues and empathy messages that you've taken away from this series of webinars?
Thanks, Kitty. I suppose there have been kind of numerous messages that kind of spring to mind, but ones that I think particularly salient for me kind of go into about 4 or 5 categories. The first one is the fact that kind of empathy messages, that empathy waxes and wanes for people. It waxes and gets better and wanes with the pressure of lockdown as we've experienced. For some people, not seeing each other has been a huge challenge. I'm particularly thinking of, we can think clearly of grandparents who haven't seen their grandchildren and you can't hug a person on Skype, and you can't even hug a person at all now because of COVID-19, which has had huge, I think, distress for people over time as the lockdown went on. So on one hand, not seeing people has been a stress and has evoked a need for empathy in people. Conversely, actually seeing too much of somebody may have caused the problem, in that, you know, being cooped up in a confined space, even though we love each other, sometimes living together can be difficult. There have been extreme cases, as we know, and worryingly so, in terms of the reports from domestic violence agencies, not just in Ireland, but throughout the world, of how dangerous lockdown has been for them. I think a key issue for people has been the fact that is the unknown aspect of lockdown and COVID-19, and that came across, I think, in the webinars. I'm particularly thinking of Caroline O'Hanlon in the webinar we had on sport, where she, with Yolanda Anton from Barcelona Football Club, from the foundation, both highlighted the fact that it was the ongoing unknown nature of COVID-19. If somebody was to say to you, you know, this is for 6 weeks or 7 weeks, and we are sure and certain of our future pathway, then people would cope. But the problem is, and the problem continues to be, much and all as we don't like it, that we don't know when we're going to be out of the woods completely with COVID-19. You know, as recently as yesterday in Ireland, you know, we saw that our pathway is not simple and clear. I suppose a key issue that has emerged for people as well from learning around the empathy webinars has been that we actually, on a positive note, have seen incredible civic engagement. And Colin Regan from the GAA, and also our colleagues in the Centre for Disability Law and Policy, looking at issues of disability and COVID-19, all highlighted the fact that as a civic society, we have dug deep, and we have shown sides of our humanity. And in a way, that has been an important message for us here in NUI Galway as a university, as to what is the university about, what is the function. And is it, as I believe it does, go way beyond just education. It's about our contribution to civic society and our relationship with civic society. And I think COVID-19 has made us maybe value that more for the first time than before. It certainly has made me value it more. And, you know, I'm particularly thinking of the contribution from colleagues from South Africa, Helene Peters, and the brilliant foundation that she's working with, you know, is just unbelievable. And the young people that she had participating from the townships in Kailicha in Cape Town, who talked about what was it like to be in lockdown in Cape Town. And that, you know, that was another great example. And I suppose what really struck me about that from the empathy message, and this is kind of the fourth and final point I wanted to make, is that we are seeing world leaders that have been outstanding in terms of their leadership around our humanity and empathy in COVID-19. And I think New Zealand is a very good case to cite in that regard. There have been some cases where leaders have not, I think, demonstrated as much empathy as they could have. And I'm not going to get into naming them. People can work out for themselves who that may or may not be. But one thing that really struck me in thinking about that is this relationship between empathy and leadership. And actually, strong human and very democratic leadership is probably the greatest example of societal empathy that we can produce. And I do think, in terms of Mark's work and my work with UNESCO, we're seeing that across many member states of UNESCO. And in fact, a study that Mark and I are just commencing on, a global study on measuring with youth as researchers the impact of COVID-19 across what already 104 countries have sought to participate, has shown that there is a genuine hunger to create more empathic societies.
Thanks, Pat. Our last speaker this evening is Kate Berardi, who is a fellow at the University of Pennsylvania. And she's going to tell us a bit about her work on empathy and the research project with Mark.
Hello, everyone. I'm honored to be here. Thank you for having me. I am a research fellow finishing up my PhD, and I've been working about 4 years looking at the best practices in empathy education. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about those research results, and as well as another sort of reflective study that a group of us did about communities and empathy during the COVID-19 pandemic. So first of all, a little bit about my research on empathy education. This research has been done in a variety of settings. I've looked at my specific dissertation research was on undergraduate, formal and non-formal classroom settings, but I've also gone into high schools here in the United States, as well as some teacher professional development. And the curriculum is pretty awesome as it you can have interactive lessons that walk the students through the definition of empathy, practicing empathy skills such as listening, critical thinking, recognizing and understanding emotions of others, and also emotions of themselves, and then taking time to reflect and process those lessons over about the course lasts for the undergraduates, it's about 4 weeks. For professional development for teachers, it's about 2 days, and for high school students, it's about 12 weeks. Overall, though, it's about 8 to 10 hours. It just depends on how spread out it is. So the cool thing about this research is that the initial results here and in Ireland are showing that it increases empathy awareness and practice. So it's working. As Charlotte was saying, empathy is a skill. And so allowing people time to practice that empathy increases their ability to empathize and have active empathy in their communities. One of the main things that I'm seeing come out of it is relationship building. So the students are meeting up after class. They're continuing their friendships for months after the class ends. And I also appreciate from them that I get contacted and they'll send me thank you notes or emails or things like that just to tell me that they're seeing empathy in their lives in ways that they hadn't before and talking about how the course impacted them. So as I said, the course is working, and being able to teach empathy is something that I've really enjoyed doing. I'm also looking to see which parts specifically of the course affect empathy the most. And so there are kind of 4 main parts. The first is defining empathy. The second is recognizing emotions. The third is understanding someone's emotions. And the fourth is differentiating the self from the other. So I can see this research going forward and finding out which is the most impactful part, and then hopefully using that to help others gain that skill of empathy and increase their empathy in communities. And speaking of empathy in communities, I wanted to talk about sort of a reflective study that, as I said, a group of colleagues and I did during the COVID-19 pandemic. And Charlotte mentioned that, you know, in order to keep society moving, we're going to have to figure out how to keep empathy as a part of it when the pandemic ends. And we found that empathy is a key to building and rebuilding strong communities. So, you know, others have said today that empathy is something that helps, you know, lower externalizing behaviors, helps with understanding social competencies. And so these are the actions, these empathetic acts, whether they be small or large, that are going to help communities build in the future. So we took a closer look at some of these empathetic acts happening in our communities and around the world. And we found that they come from a place of love and understanding, these empathetic acts. And a small individual act can have a ripple effect that turns the community into a place of empathy. And so in this way, empathy provides a structure of helpfulness and kindness that builds better communities for everyone. So by helping the most vulnerable at a time, you know, and that can switch. The most vulnerable one day could be someone who can help the next day, and vice versa. And so by helping them, it leads to this ripple effect of strong communities that are built on empathy and social support. So there's this cycle that we saw in resilient communities that we think will help rebuild after COVID-19. And that is this idea that, encouraging individual empathetic acts, such as talking to the cashier at the grocery store, or listening and being present for a neighbor who has to vent about something they're being frustrated about, can lead to collective empathetic acts where more and more people are realizing that these empathetic acts feel good and they want to help others. And so they then perform empathetic acts of their own. And eventually the entire community is resilient in an ideal situation where the community is full of empathy, they're helping each other, and they're building on these strengths and community ties. So, as we discussed, empathy isn't just about feeling good, it's about helping others and building your own self-esteem, as well as building your strong communities and allowing for these human interactions that are simple yet impactful. And so I wanted to end with a quote from Fred Rogers, who is a famous humanitarian, and he talks about empathy in a lot of his work. But I have a quote here that I wanted to read for you. Imagine what our real neighbors would be like if each of us offered, as a matter of course, just one kind word to another person. There have been so many stories about the lack of courtesy, the impatience of today's world, road rage, and even restaurant rage. Sometimes all it takes is one kind word to nourish another person. Think of the ripple effect that can be created when we nourish someone. One kind, empathetic word has a wonderful way of turning into many. Thank you for allowing me to speak this evening.
Thank you, Kate. There's been quite a few questions coming in from all over the world, actually I have a few questions myself, but I'll come to the questions first that have been coming in. Mari in Long Island in New York has asked, now that we are so used to living with COVID-19, is empathy still as relevant and is it still as needed as you are arguing? I don't know who wants to take that up first. Maybe Pat?
Yeah, I'm very happy to take it up, Kitty. I suppose you could argue that to some extent there may be an element of empathy fatigue. I have to say, as a social scientist, I'm delighted with COVID-19 because traditionally empathy was seen as in the domain of neuroscience and psychology. The one thing we've learned about COVID-19 is that it is actually about, as Kate just rightly said, community development. It really is about community building and about social capital and those things. And, you don't want to make this sound like empathy is the Brady Bunch. It's not. It's not, as simple as a mushy feeling. It is very real. And as Mark once said to me, empathy is the same thing as using a fire extinguisher. Most people have never read the instructions on a fire extinguisher, and the first time they ever read it is when there's a fire. And in many ways, I think COVID-19 has had a fire extinguisher effect on our empathy because it has made us, everybody right around the world, no matter who you are, no matter where you are, no matter what your agenda is in life, it's made you really value and think about your own relationships because lockdown has made us slow down and think. And whereas that initial surge, as I mentioned earlier, the waxing of empathy is in place, despite fatigue, we're still going to need this. And one of the things I would like is that all of us come out of this into civic society with a much more enlightened view about what actually is important and what matters.
Okay, Charlotte, would you like to say anything on that? Do you think that we've got so used to COVID-19 now, and will empathy continue to matter?
Yes, well, I hope so. Is the right response, and it is something I suppose I was concerned of or wondering myself. I think COVID has been helpful in bringing our attention to empathy more, and it's become part of people's vocabulary in a way that never has been. And we're talking about it a lot more than we did. And I think this is great, but we don't want to see empathy as something that's temporary. Empathy is important every day, as I said, and in normal circumstances, as well. What COVID has done is shown us how much a simple act of kindness can help someone, and how small acts of empathy can make a difference. So even something as simple now as staying at home can have the potential of saving someone's life. But beyond COVID, there are other issues that people face in everyday, and they need empathy as well. We shouldn't just see empathy as something that we promote in an emergency or in an extreme situation, but we can also do small things in our everyday lives that can make a real difference to someone. I always remember that quote that, one small act mightn't change the world, but you can change the world for that person. And I think that's why we need empathy. And I think this is a great opportunity for us to think about how we can move forward, because we're talking about it more, and because there's been more awareness brought to the importance of empathy now as a result of COVID. There's lots of negative things that have resulted or come out of this pandemic, but I think this is one of the real positives that we can learn as a society. And as Kate mentioned, if we want to thrive as a community or as a society and not just survive, then empathy is really key for that.
Thanks a million, Charlotte. There was one thing that struck me, and maybe Mark would like to answer this. Empathy, I would have thought, was something that came very naturally to human beings, that we are very social and need each other, and that perhaps is disrupted by things like poverty, by the pressures of life, by capitalism indeed, and that maybe it's about retaining that empathy rather than learning it. Is that something that people think about, that empathy is a natural thing that in human beings that is actually disrupted rather than that it's something we need to learn?
Yeah, it's a brilliant question. And, some of Charlotte's work and some work of colleagues we work with UNESCO that have done things in the areas of neuroscience and things like that, as Pat mentioned. We are born with it. And it is very much like any other muscle. There's a small piece of your brain right over here that it shrinks and grows depending on how much you practice and build empathy. So we need to keep maintaining it in that way. But the one thing I think we've seen through a lot of our research is that, again, it cuts across all the divisions we have. It's not necessarily luxury of the people that have money or wealth or live in a northern hemisphere or whatever. The fact is, all of our lives come down to our local communities. They come down to our local places. And I think all of us can have examples about how we were shaped by people exhibiting and providing empathy to us at all stages of our development. And I think as you look into developing countries in contexts where there's high poverty or other things, those social supports, that empathy provided by neighbors, friends, siblings, all kinds of people, is absolutely fundamental. And I think that makes civil society happen in those places. In other places, say in developed countries, I think we often can get caught up in our lives and we get a little, we forget to exhibit and practice empathy. Just going back to our last question there, I think one of the things we're going to have to look out for once this whole pandemic is over is, we may get back to our routines and we may not practice as much. We've done a lot of hard work over the last 3 or 4 months as individuals of looking after our families and friends. It's very easy to fall back in our routines and to be less tolerant and caring. We may even see some people that say, I've used up my quota of empathy. I did my part during the pandemic. I don't need to practice anymore. And that's the kind of things we have to kind of fight against. This is absolutely critical across the board in many, many aspects of our social, societal, individual development. It's not something that just comes and goes with a particular problem like we have now. So that was your great question. You're absolutely dead on with it.
Thanks. There's a question in here from someone in Scotland asking, where do we go now the series is over? What's next in the campaign for worldwide empathy?
What do you think, Pat? Another series?
Who would like to take that? Maybe the professor or Pat. Yeah.
Well, I think we are planning. We've had a huge response to this webinar series, which is incredible and very positive. We've had a few loonies as well, but leaving that aside, I think our plan is to have a follow-up short webinar series towards the end of November, and really revisit a very short kind of like a booster of empathy between Penn State and NUI Galway. Assuming Kieran and colleagues in NUI Galway agree with this, but our plan is that also I should mention that particularly colleagues in my centre, including Dr. Bernadine Brady and Dr. Ciara Boylan, as well as Charlotte and I and Jack and Ella, there's quite a bit of a team growing here who are really showing huge interest in this, and I have to say across the Institute for Life Course and Society and indeed the Moore Institute and other colleagues. So I think our plan is, with our ongoing marriage to Penn State, assuming it survives, is to turn this into a bit more of a major project. So we certainly do have plans.
Okay,
Yeah,
and there's a question. Yeah, go on, Mark.
Oh no, I would just echo that. I think we've had a very long partnership with NUI Galway, and it's been certainly one of the most productive and fruitful and rewarding of my career. But it goes back long before my career as well. Pat and I have a whole series of things in mind. We're looking at Fulbrights that'll link the two universities together more permanently. Whole series of things. I think a critical mass of empathy educators is in place, and with our UNESCO affiliations, other things, I think empathy should be pushed as a fundamental human right. That it's not just a simple activity. It's something that we need to charge the world to take on.
Okay. Another thing I might ask is, does anyone think there's a political dimension to this? It strikes me that you're all arguing for quite a left-wing view of the world, whereas there might be others then who would argue for a more individualistic or perhaps, Reaganomics type view of the world, where empathy is for suckers and community and society is for losers. Should we all just be arguing for, that everyone votes for the Democrats and for people before profit in Ireland? Is that another dimension to this? Does anyone want to take that?
I can start with that. Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a couple aspects to that. One, I think there's this tendency for people just to dismiss empathy as being, a feel-good activity. And again, and this goes to Charlotte and Kate and everyone's work. There is a massive body of research that shows conclusively this is in your best interest to do this as a society. You save a fortune on counseling and mental health. Your people are more productive. Your students are better. There's a million reasons why to do it. The other thing too is that empathy is neutral. I think as you look at a lot of the politicians that are, shall we say, not so good, they've been incredibly good at being empathetic. They've been able to understand those fears and weaknesses and challenges and anger that people have, and tapping into that. We have to keep our eye on that too.
Okay, Kate, would you like to say anything on that? Are you seeing a kind of left-right dimension to this work?
I would like ideally to say no, but unfortunately, I do see somewhat of a left-right tendency, and it goes, especially if we look at the pandemic right now. In the case of, say, mask wearing, there's it's come out as individual rights versus helping the community or helping others, and so, like Mark said, it's not neutral. I've seen leaders on both sides use empathy for their advantage, but I think that ideally societies could look beyond the left-right political debate and just realize that empathy is going to help build strong communities. It's going to save money overall, and it'll just help citizens to feel like they're a part of something bigger rather than maybe a left or a right side of things. So.
Okay. Jack, do you want to add anything in here? Have you had any thoughts on the Q&A?
In regards to the question, I'd say simply empathy, as in any emotion, really is I think that both sides of a political argument have the capability of being empathetic or non-empathetic, and in most cases they are both, depending on the issue. So I think that they have a lot to learn from empathy, really, more than anything, on both sides of the aisle. And I mean, I'm coming from a country that isn't nearly as divisive as, let's say, the United States. But certainly, I think that being empathetic and caring about other people shouldn't be a political issue.
Okay. So, we're probably coming to a close here. I'll just put one last question to the president of NUI Galway. How can universities ensure students are taught empathy when it's not at the core of their subject?
That's a great question. I think Pat will have a few of those. What we're thinking of is how to include empathy in the curriculum. So to have a sense of, that can be in many ways. That can be not only in the classroom, but also in practice in clubs and societies. So it's not just in the classroom, but it's something we're thinking of. First of all, that this is something that may be included in the curriculum and maybe part of the danger is you put it as a piece over there rather than at pervasive. And that's, I think, something we need to think about. Secondly, is the mood of an institution. I think, again, there are institutional cultures which support empathy, and certainly since I've come to Galway, I think that's a very strong sense of NUI Galway's sense of itself, is this sense of working with others, being for others, and it's something that came out in our strategy, for example, and that was very much there was a gathering around it in the context of saying, as a university, that we're for the public good, we're for students, for society and our planet, and that sense of working for others, I think, came through in that context. So there is a mood of a place, I think, that captures that as well. And then thirdly, I think one of the things I think interesting in the context of COVID is that there is also a learning opportunity here. People think that students will be, that the learning experience will be less or damaged because of COVID. I would argue that potentially it could be stronger because there is this sense of learning through uncertainty. There is this sense of learning with others and about others, and understanding the interrelationship that we have with society, that we don't stand apart, but we are a part of society. And I think there's a very powerful learning experience there too, that we can encourage rather than shut out. So I don't think it's something that we should then deny, but something that we should embrace as this sense of uncertainty that we're all in together. And that even as a university and as colleagues in university, we don't have all the answers, and therefore we're on a journey with our students towards a better place, we hope. So all of those, I think, capture that a little bit. And I would say, in the context of the question of after COVID or coming out of COVID, in a way we maybe need more empathy coming out, because we're all coming at a different pace. When society closed, it was crisp, it was clear. Where now there are different competing interests and people wanting to move ahead quicker, some more cautious. And we need to, I think empathy will serve us really well in understanding each other's pace and saying and understanding, well, okay, this person is enthusiastic and that's a good thing. They want to move ahead quicker. This person is cautious and that's a good thing. They maybe want to move ahead slower. So that sense of understanding, I think we still need, because we're now all in different places, and understanding it through understanding each other, I think, is a very important part of that. But in the curriculum, I think it can be in the curriculum, but maybe even more importantly, in the mood of a place and how we think about ourselves and articulate that sense of learning together through uncertainty.
Absolutely, yeah. Okay, well, we're 1 minute to 7. I've been asked to wrap this up by 7, so I'm going to ask Mark to come in with some closing thoughts on this evening, and indeed on the whole series, which sounds like it's been absolutely fascinating. I've missed them, but that's my loss. Thanks, Mark. You close first.
No, that's great, and thanks. And by the way, all these are all the webinars have been they're on YouTube, on NUI Galway's YouTube channel, and on our websites as well. So they're all out there. It's been absolutely fantastic, and I'll let Pat chime in here as well. But I just wanted to just say a few things. It's been 3 months, 12 sessions, tens of thousands of people connecting in, and we just want to say thank you to everyone there. To Kieran, we wanted to say thank you for all of the support and the partnership and the linkage between Penn State and NUI Galway, and in particular ILIS and Moore Center and the UNESCO Child and Family Research Center have been just among some of the best out there. And it's a long-term friendship and partnership that's doing great things, and we're going to keep that going forever. Dave Brandt and Brandt Studios were just remarkable for making everything happen during this whole process. We'd be lost without you, Dave, and you made us look and sound presentable, which is a big task, especially for Pat and I. Catherine White and Leanne Leeson, thank you so much for making this series accessible to everyone. It was an absolute pleasure and honor working with you. Jillian Brown and Joanne Ford for all the ideas, the logistics, the advice, and the guidance. Just been remarkable. And then the last thing I would just say here, and I'll just hand over to Pat then, as with many of our great partnerships and projects, the series, this Global Conversation series, was the brainchild of Pat. So thank you, Pat, for making this and everything happen. I've never ceased to be amazed by Pat's ability to spot the most important way to make the world better and then get people to move on it. And that was certainly the case with this. I remember very well early in April, getting a quick phone call saying, I've had a brainstorm. We need to do a conversation on this. And it's been amazing. And it's been an absolute honor and privilege to do it. And I think we've done some really great things here. So thank you, everyone. And I'll hand over to Pat now.
It's the first time I've ever been embarrassed on a webinar. But I particularly want to thank Catherine and Lorraine, who've supported us through signing to every event. They've been absolutely brilliant and have had to put up with people speaking too fast, myself included. But I don't want it to sound like a mutual admiration society, but Mark has been a great colleague, and as has everybody at Penn State, and this has been a very successful event. The one thing I'd say is that it's not down to me as an individual, it's down to an amazing set of people that I'm lucky enough to work with, who I continue to learn so much from. And thanks to you, Kitty, for moderating. You're a great friend and colleague, and indeed to Carol for the first one. So the Irish Times have topped and tailed us on the series. And just to say, stay safe, stay well to everybody, and don't forget to practice your empathy, which I will try. And we'll see you for the follow-up webinars towards the end of November. Thank you.